Darren completed his undergraduate studies in physics and astronomy at the University of Toronto, where he was part of the Newman Catholic Students Club. He completed his master's in physics at the University of Waterloo, where he was a part of the St. John Paul II Student Center. He's now pursuing a PhD in physics at Cornell University starting in January, so we wish him really good luck on that. And he's also a member of the Society of Catholic Scientists, an organization of Catholic scientists from all around the world. So I think he's perfect to speak on this topic. So Darren, it is great to meet you, and we really want to just get ahead with this, and we're just really excited about this. How can we as teenagers comprehend what we mean by God in the light of science?
So I think I'll start off with an analogy, which is golf. So when you have golfing, you have a man who moves his hands to move a stick to hit a ball. Now, if there was no man, or if he was dead, then the stick, the hands, the ball, they don't move. So really, when things are set into motion here, the ball doesn't move itself. It's a motion that comes from the golfer. Okay, so hold that idea in your mind about the golfer. When we talk about God, it's very similar, except instead of motion, we're talking about existence. That sounds abstract, but stay with me. So things that we see in the world, they don't cause themselves to exist. They don't create themselves. And if they could be one way or another, then we have to ask why they are the way they are. So I didn't bring myself into existence. The trees you see outside didn't bring themselves into existence. So it's kind of like the ball. The ball, the golf ball, it didn't move itself. Exactly. We had to look for something else that caused it to move. Things that exist, they don't cause themselves to exist, so we have to look for what caused them to exist, what gave them existence. And so just as we concluded, there must have been a golfer that gave it this motion, when we speak about God, we say God is the source of all existence. He's the start of this chain, and all existence comes from God. So this is a very philosophical idea of God, and even I think, Greek philosophers had this idea that God is the source of all existence. Now, again, sounds abstract, but it's really cool, especially as Catholics, that when we look at the Bible, Moses asks God in Exodus, "Tell me your name," and God's answer is, "I am." So already he has this idea of existence itself, the source of existence. And even Jesus says, "I am" to the Pharisees, and they get really mad, and you're wondering why. It's because he's claiming this equality with God. So I think that's the way we really think about what we mean when we say God. Now, you did say in light of science. So I think it's interesting to note this idea of God doesn't conflict with science at all, because science studies created things that are already in existence, and God is the one who gave them existence. So they're kind of like two levels, kind of like an author and a book.
Yes.
The book would be like science, the things that we see in the world, but there's still an author, there's still a creator of it. And so there's really no conflict between science and God when we think of God in this way.
Exactly. Thank you for that, Darren. And I like that analogy of the golfer and the ball. That is a good analogy. And that's something that, as simple as it might sound, it's a good way to understand the fundamental basics. So thank you for sharing. Yeah. All right. So I want to ask you the next question. What is the Christian perspective on the Big Bang Theory and our faith?
So didn't expect a little show and tell. There's a great book, Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, talks all about this by Stephen Barr.
Take note, guys.
So the Big Bang Theory and our faith. I think the first thing that we should mention is that the Big Bang Theory was actually proposed by a Catholic priest, Father George Lemaitre.
Yes.
So already I think we should know, okay, there's not going to be a problem with the Catholic faith and the Big Bang Theory if it was a priest who brought it up. So let's go back to the author. I love analogies, and I think the author's story analogy is a great one.
Yeah.
So if you think of Shakespeare and one of his plays, the plays have a beginning, Act 1, and they have an author, Shakespeare. Now, I don't know when you were in elementary school, Julia, but when I remember on the bus, we would sing the song that never ends, where the last lyric leads into the first lyric, and it just goes on and on and on and on.
Oh,
so that song has no beginning and no end. It just goes forever, but it still needs an author. So when we talk about the universe and the Big Bang Theory, we have to realize that some people thought the universe existed for all time. Sure, that's like a story that never ends, but it still needs an author, which would be the creator God.
Exactly.
Now we have the Big Bang Theory, which may seem to suggest that there is a beginning to the universe, a beginning in time. And in that case, it's kind of like Shakespeare, it still needs an author. So really, the Big Bang Theory in that sense hasn't really changed much because we always need an author. So I will say the Catholic Church back in like the year 1200 taught that the universe should have a beginning in time. So it's very cool to see, like, 800 years later, that science is actually suggesting something that the Catholic Church had actually put forward centuries ago.
Exactly. And that's a good point to note that, the Big Bang Theory was something that was brought forward by someone who is Catholic, someone that was a member of the church. So it's good to note that. And again, I like your analogy. I just like your analogies there. They help me to understand better things. So that God is the author of the Big Bang Theory, just as we need an author for a book. So I really like that analogy, Darren.
Could I jump in? I just saw a perfect comment from Audrey here.
Yeah.
And I think it's really beautiful to think about the laws of physics and realizing that they don't cause things to happen. So I can write the equation for how a ball moves, but that doesn't move the ball.
Exactly.
I still have to throw it. So the laws for the Big Bang Theory, the laws of physics that describe it, that doesn't mean they cause it. So thank you, Audrey. That's a great comment.
Yes, Audrey. Thank you for that. And thanks for the explanation, Darren. All right, so let's move on to our next question. What is the Christian perspective on evolution and our faith?
Well, show and tell number 2. Great book here. Thomistic Evolution, written by a bunch of Catholic priests. I know 2 of them personally. Excellent priests.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a few things. I'm going to say why I think people have an issue with evolution and the Catholic faith and why it shouldn't be an issue. So one is the idea of God of the gaps, so it's called. So imagine I didn't know about gravity at all, and I saw an apple fall. I may say, oh, God did that. And then when I discover the law of gravity, I may think, oh, well, if there's gravity, that explains it, then I don't need to talk about God. There is no God, it was just gravity all along. That's not how we talk about God. Like I said before, he's kind of different from the laws of physics. He's not part of it in that way. But when people have this idea that God is in competition with science, then it can seem like, oh, evolution gets rid of a need for God. That's not true. So evolution explains how organisms in our physical bodies have evolved from natural selection. And there's no problem with believing that, because God can work through that to bring about the created world, to bring about human beings, and to bring about whatever order he wants to see in this world. And so God acting through the laws of science is really no problem, because again, he's different from that. He's not kind of competing with gravity or competing with evolution, but he's working through them.
He's working through that.
Yeah, that's the way I like to see it. I think you love my analogies, so let's go with another one.
Yes.
I think another conflict that people have is with the book of Genesis.
Yes.
And with interpreting the Bible. So I think a good analogy here, I love analogies too, Julia, is the analogy of a library, because the Bible shouldn't be thought of as a single book, but as a collection of books.
Yes.
And if you have a collection of books, you need to know the right mode and the right genre to read it in. So the Bible is not meant to be a scientific textbook. That is not the genre it's part of.
Exactly.
The point of the Bible, and even Genesis, is to show us the relationship that God wants from us, the way that he pursues us and wants to love us, and to show us the good news of Jesus Christ dying and rising to save us. Now, to see Genesis, people think, oh, doesn't that say that, God created the world and that's against evolution? No, because that's not what Genesis is all about. In fact, Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 have 2 different stories of creation. And so really, it's not trying to convey scientific facts in Genesis. It's trying to convey a message of salvation. So really, there's no problem with our bodies coming about through evolution. And if that's a perfectly scientific theory to explain how we came about, then that's perfectly fine. The only thing I think that needs to be said is we believe we have immaterial souls. And if it's immaterial, it can't come about through a material process like evolution. So that is something that we would say, and the church teaches, God gives us. But otherwise, our physical bodies come from evolution, no problem at all.
Thank you for that, Darren. As Miss Farah said, beautifully expressed. You're so articulate and explaining, and you make me really understand it well. So thank you, Darren, for that.
You're welcome.
All right, so we're going to talk about the next question. Can you briefly talk about the church's relationship with science, historically and now in the present?
All right, show and tell number 3. Great textbook for a high school student, Faith, Science, and Reason by Chris Baglow. He has an excellent chapter on the history and relationship of the church and science. So everything that I'm saying is just a fraction of what he's saying. So very surface level, I think one of the awesome things to note is that the church has always been a very good sponsor of science. So materially, the church has given a lot of money and funds back, for example, in the medieval times. And they've had a lot of different religious orders, such as the Jesuits, who were astronomers, who were physicists, who were scientists. And so there was always this community, this financial support, this material support for pursuing science. I think another thing is that there were also, they didn't have the internet back then to talk about scientific research, to send each other articles, say, hey, did you see this new result? So there were actually churches and monasteries that served as meeting places for scientists so that they could disseminate their results and communicate with each other.
I didn't even know that. Wow.
Yeah, again, that textbook, great textbook.
Yeah.
But I think one of the really cool contributions of Catholicism to the field of science is actually that some historians will say that science was actually born from Christianity.
Yes, that is what I heard as well. And that's a good point. So I'm glad that you brought that up, Darren.
Yeah, so here's why they said this. So there were ancient civilizations, such as the Greeks, who believed that the universe had to be the way it was, and that it would repeat in a cycle, and everything would just happen again and again, and there was no controlling it. If that's the way you think about it, you're not going to be very motivated to study cause and effect, to study science, because things just have to be that way.
Yeah.
There were other civilizations that believed that the universe itself was God. And if you think that the tree is a deity or that nature is a deity, then you're not going to want to do experiments on it, because that seems irreverent. Now, here comes Catholicism, and we teach that the world is good. The world is not God, but is created by a good God. The world reflects his beauty, reflects his intelligence, reflects his providence, his order, and it's good to do science. It's good to study this world. And so all of a sudden, there's a lot more motivation to study science. And so I don't think it's a mistake that the scientific revolution happened during the Christian era.
Exactly, yes. And I'm glad that you brought that point up, that, the church and science, they're two things that are correlated. They're not two separate globes or two separate poles. They come together. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, there's a lot of people, I think, as well, that live that out. So there was, Father George Lemaitre, we talked about, the founder of the Big Bang. I don't know what grade you're in, but if you heard of Gregor Mendel from your biology class, he was the father of
the Mendelian. Yeah, I'm doing biology right now. And
so he's a Catholic monk, and he was the he's the father of genetics, they call him.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah.
I think he was a monk. That's interesting to know.
I think it was a monk, friar, or priest. I'm not exactly sure which one.
Wow. Okay.
There's also, I know Catholics right now who are scientists. I know a professor at Cornell in astrophysics, a professor at Harvard in astrophysics, a priest who did his PhD in biology at MIT, a Catholic theoretical physicist who's like a father of 5 children. So not only in the past with these different examples, but right now in the present, there's lots of Catholic scientists.
And as Ms. Ferrer said, did people know Pope Francis has a degree as a chemistry technician? Did you know that, Darren? Because I actually didn't.
I remember that when he was elected Pope, I think back in 2013. I remember reading about that, but I completely forgot that.
Wow. And some say that the wise men were astronologists. I actually didn't know that. So that's cool to know. All right. So I'm going to ask you the next question, Darren. What is the Galileo controversy, and how does it pertain to science and our faith as Catholics? So if you can just really start from the very basics, because even me, I'm not too sure what it is.
Yeah. Okay. So again, the textbook that I mentioned before, Faith, Science, and Reason, great textbook for this. They have a section on the Galileo controversy as well. So I think this is, again, the church has had a great history with science, but this was one kind of hiccup along the road. But people see it as the defining relationship that the church has with science, which is not true. It's just the exception. It's not the norm. So I think it's really important to get this right. So essentially, Galileo had helped put forward the model of heliocentrism, which is that the Earth revolves around the sun, whereas before Galileo and in that time, people believed that everything revolved around the Earth, called geocentrism.
Okay.
And for reasons I'll explain shortly, he was actually condemned by certain church officials from teaching that position. Now, it's a very complicated issue, so I'm going to talk a little bit about it on both sides. There were mistakes that were kind of made both ways. So Galileo, he actually didn't have enough scientific proof to conclude that the Earth revolved around the sun. He had some suggested proof, but it wasn't conclusive. That actually only came about, I think, like 100 years after Galileo passed away. So really, Galileo didn't have enough evidence to back what he was saying. So that was kind of a mistake on Galileo's side. Now, on the church side, there were some officials who thought that some passages in the Bible suggested that the Earth doesn't move. It said things like the Earth was stable. And this was the error that we were talking about before, where the Bible is not a scientific textbook. So these members were thinking, the Bible says the Earth doesn't move, so the Earth doesn't move, so Galileo must be wrong. And so they kind of said, you are not allowed to teach this. And then, so Galileo, he kind of tried teaching it anyway underneath Pope Urban VIII, who was one of his close friends, and he kind of wrote a play, I think it was, where he put the words of the Pope in a character called the Fool. So he kind of made fun of the Pope, who was his friend at the time.
All right.
And the Pope, he felt betrayed and humiliated, and he kind of did more punishments towards Galileo by putting him under house arrest that, wasn't really the right thing to do. I think the Pope is a human being too, and I think he was actually just really hurt by a close friend.
Mm-hmm.
So there were errors on both sides, but I think since then, St. John Paul II, when he was Pope, he issued a committee to look into this, and he issued a formal apology on behalf of the church for the way that Galileo was treated, just because he knew that Galileo was doing good science, and there was these members of the church who had misinterpreted scripture and then punished Galileo unaccordingly.
All right.
Yeah.
What can we take from that, do you think? Like, what can we take from that experience about, what happened to Galileo and the whole controversy?
Yeah. I think, firstly, it's the distinction we made before, that the Bible is not a scientific textbook. It's meant to convey the truth of salvation in our faith. Mm-hmm. And so not trying to read scientific facts from the Bible. But I think what's really important to remember is that philosophy, theology, science, these are all great forms of knowledge. These are all great bodies of study, but they all have individual methods. They all have individual avenues. They all have individual results, and they have to do their own thing. So as soon as we start conflicting them, like saying, oh, the Bible, which is theological, says something about the world, which is scientific, then we're going to start to get into a little bit of trouble. So it's just making sure that we know what the boundaries of each are. And I think that was what the problem was with the church officials with the Galileo trial.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Thank you so much for that answer, Darren. And before we get into the last question, I want to ask anyone in the chat, if you have any questions for Darren, put them in the chat so that after we finish our last question, you can show them up on screen and ask Darren and present him with those questions. All right, Darren, so last question. You're a PhD student in science. How can someone who's so immensely occupied with science and scientific theories be able to perceive Christianity and believing in our faith as a whole? How can you explain seeing and not believing, which is a big component of our Christian faith?
So one I would say is that God is the source of all truth. Even Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And so when we receive truth, whether that is from our faith or from science or from reason, it cannot conflict because it all comes from God, and God does not contradict himself. So that's one thing. So all truth will come from God. And so we know that there won't be these conflicts. Mm-hmm. But I also think faith is not as blind as we sometimes say, because faith and reason go together. So when we talked about God's existence, what I gave to you was actually a philosophical proof. It's not a scientific proof, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just using philosophy and our reason. And so faith is guided by our reason, and that way I can know things even if I don't see God. I can know them through my mind, and I can know them by reasoning.
Exactly.
But I think going particularly to the question of science, because you're asking me as a PhD student in science, there's one really beautiful passage in the Book of Wisdom, chapter 13, that I really love. It says, from the beauty and goodness of created things comes a corresponding perception of their creator. And I think for me, that's like my motto as a scientist. Because I see that faith and science don't conflict with each other. It's not like if I go one way, then I'm going away from the other. But for me, science deepens my faith because it reveals to me God's glory, his goodness, his providence, his love. And so by doing science, I can reveal that to the world and learn it myself. And I think, particularly we're going into Christmas now. And I think really the created world is a reflection of God. When we come to Christmas, what are we celebrating? We're celebrating Jesus Christ being born. That is God in the flesh, dwelling among us. That is Jesus walking our earth, talking with us, living with us, and most of all, dying and rising from the dead to save us from our sins. It's like he's saying, I would rather die than spend eternity without you with me. And so science for me deepens my faith because it reveals a reflection of God. But now with Jesus Christ, we see God entering the world tangibly in the flesh. And that's something that's not seeing without, or not believing without seeing, but really something that we can see, we can believe when God enters into our world in Christmas.
I really like that, Darren, because you said science deepens your faith because it's a reflection of God. And as a scientist, I think that that's no better, there's no better analogy than that. And honestly, I took so many things from your little segment with us here today, and I'm pretty sure everyone else, all our other viewers did as well. So we just want to say a big, big thank you, Darren, for being here with us today and for speaking on the topic of faith and our science. We really enjoyed having you, and just thank you from the bottom of my heart. Seriously, it means a lot.
Thank you for having me. I was happy to be here. Hope it helped.
So much.
Hope you liked it.
All right, thank you. We'll say bye to you for now. Bye, Darren.